Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 362 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we are going to use Helmod to figure out how many rockets per minute we'll be able to do, and what the resources that go into them will be. Enjoy! And now we have the SpaceX tab. Our first goal is to launch 175 satellites to make a satellite network before we can continue. So, to plan for a rocket build, we can use the Helmod section at the end here, where we normally calculate for power, and we can select various things. Well, the satellite creates science, and that's ultimately what we want to do. So we can go here and say things like output, and we can select how much science we wanted. And interestingly, it really doesn't take that much to keep up with our science setup now, but we're going to need to do way more science in this, so I kind of want to see the absolute limit of how many rockets we could launch, and then plan around that, even if in the end we end up not launching that many. So instead, let's set the output to 0 and calculate by factory, which then means we can just say how many silos we want to have. And I'm thinking for now maybe we'll try 20. I'm guessing the factory will be able to support between 50 and 100 silos, something like that, but for now we'll just do 20. And it has its big requirements here, and that's about all of the low density structure that we have. But the silo is one of those things besides the labs where you really want productivity modules. So it makes about half of the amount of science packs because the machines are slowed down, but it only requires about a quarter of the input. And just these 20 silos is 1.2 gigawatts. But you see that even though we have 20 silos, the actual input, especially with the expensive satellite, is actually quite small. So we really could crank this up if we want to. So let's do the individual components. Each one of these is going to need to be delivered to the silo. So let's do some of the easy stuff first, like the rocket engines. That only requires tungsten, so we would just use tungsten that's on the bus for that. And this is something that can use productivities, but it also creates pollution, so we probably want to cut one of them out and do a pollution cleaning. And at some point I'll go through the factory and take a look at pollution and see what our module complement should be, because it's actually holding up pretty well considering all of this research that we've been doing. Like, there's some definite spiky areas, but it's only bad at that very area, because then the moment that the pollution moves outwards, it's captured by these various farms. So we don't have that giant cloud of pollution like we used to have. So I just want to see how it works, and if everything's looking great, we can throw more productivities in there. And actually, one thing we potentially could use is the final tier of assembler. It will take a little while to research, but it will be quite useful. So let's throw that in there and calculate based on having that, because that will give us an extra module slot. Instead of 5, we will now have 6. We'll require the 7 machines, but that's no big deal. Requires tungsten plates and the tungsten gear wheels. The gear wheels could also be made next door, but in fact these gears are already being made on the bus all the way at the end here. But we want to calculate for them anyway, because what we're trying to see here is what the absolute limit of the factory might be. So we'll put some modules in there just so we have the tungsten plate as an input, so we have an idea of what's going into this, because I'm looking for limiting factors. What's going to ultimately say how many rockets we can launch? The low density structure is already being made elsewhere, so now we need to do the heat shielding tile. And what's interesting about these tiles is they're actually made in a sintering oven, which seems to be an ore bus item, but the items it's made out of are silicon nitride and tungsten carbide, which are already being delivered to this bus. So we should probably, even though it's going to be really out of place, just put the sintering ovens here. And I guess I haven't mentioned that either, that ultimately where I'm planning on building the rockets is actually on the main bus. All of the things we're going to need, for the most part, are going to be here, not to mention it has tons of bus lanes. So this makes sense, and we have all of this extra space to put rocket silos down. So I think it'll be fine. So to make this, it's going to be an enormous setup, so we're going to need that space. And it's also going to have an enormous input of silicon nitride and tungsten carbide. Both of those are 60 items a second. And actually, that's one other thing we need to do is update these setups to stop using productivity, since now we can make tungsten as fast as we want. And that's going to be a lot of machines, and then we'll have to go through there and figure out what modules we want to put in there. But this was calculated based on having speeds. That's probably going to take a little while to update, so we'll just let those do their thing. Our silicon nitride, it's actually only 30. That's kind of surprising. Well, we could put more in here. We have higher tier machines, we have higher tier modules, so we could get 60 out of that. But certainly not 120. Building rockets is going to expose the weak part of our factory. But first of all, we're going to have the better sintering ovens, so that drops the number down. Plus, they have 3 module slots. And if we throw them up with productivities, which in this situation we probably should, because these are going to be expensive items. It's 283 machines, which is a lot, but it's not insane. And as far as pollution, it's 83 pollution a minute. It's not necessarily a lot compared to the factory, but we could way drop it down with a pollution cleaning module in there, which we probably should make that attempt. So this will just about max out silicon nitride if we upgrade that setup to do 60. So that's a reasonable number. It was a narrow miss, but it's reasonable. And certainly we can keep up with the low density structure. So let's make the rocket control units. This will be made on the circuits bus and just sent down here. So all productivities except maybe a pollution cleaning in there. And then that drops the numbers to something that's more reasonable. And these are very much in line with the other bus items. Most of those are already being delivered for modules. But I doubt we're going to be making all of our modules all of the time. So instead of making a whole new setup, making more components, we could just put this on the end here and just use these components, and we'll have to send the blue boards down. But they are actually being sent on the bus. They just end here. Computer components are not very dense. They're bigger than the resources that go into them. So even though these numbers look big, it does not take very much to make 38 CPUs. Just as an example here, it kind of looks like a lot, but you chop the silicon wafers down, and then you only need the 7.67, but these all can get productivity modules. Stacked on top of each other, it's only 0.76. The rocket fuel is something new we're going to have to do. To make the rocket fuel, it needs the oxidizer and the fuel capsule. Because this in itself might be kind of complicated, let's do this on a new line. We need 12.46. We need to make the capsule. This comes from the nitric acid and the gas. Then the rocket fuel capsule comes from its own path, so I guess we'll do that separately. Requires dimethylhydrazine, which comes from this recipe. Then the dimethylamine comes from methylamine, mixed in with methanol. Methanol we know how to make. Methylamine comes from also methanol and ammonia gas. Then we need to figure out what we want to make next. How about the hydrazine gas, which requires the ammonia and monochloramine gas. So all of that ammonia is being added together. So that's one less thing on the list. And also, these two steps require the monochloramine gas. So that's one more thing we can calculate here, which in itself also comes from ammonia gas. Then we need lots and lots of sodium hypochlorite, which is made from chlorine and sodium hydroxide solution. So we're finally going to start using up all that salt again. It's funny though, is as big as all these numbers are, all of these setups are pretty small. It's just 1 or 2 machines into each other, so it's really going to be able to pump out the resources. We'll probably just want to make it from sodium hydroxide, and that's useful because we have an output of purified water. So we're going to use it all up by doing this, and in fact it's a perfect ratio. So this is water neutral. That is a lot of ammonia gas and a lot of chlorine. Uh-oh, we don't have room for something here. Who can't find a spot? Ah, I see, because they're breaking all this down. We probably do want to break down all these ground samples just because they have to go somewhere. Because the ground samples will be broken down in the scaffolding, which turns into wood and paper, and then the seedling nest into compost. I mean, that stuff does have an output. So, yeah, we probably should. We will eventually be able to find somewhere to get rid of all this stuff. So if we just put every item in, they'll all be sent and eventually processed because there's so much of it. One thing I did do, because it seemed like the lag was still appearing when the biters attacked, is I adjusted Swarmageddon to make less biters per tick. So I don't know if you can tell a difference. I kind of can, but they're not making nearly as many biters, and they're not dropping nearly as many orbs either. And there's not as much lag every time they get hit. And the setting for that was in Swarmageddon, where the maximum number of new biters per tick was defaulted to 100, and that is a lot of biters for every single tick. So I set that to 10. That's still going to be 600 biters a second that can spawn. So I think that's fine, and that seemed to really help. And it looks like all of our labs were built, and now they are definitely running low on their resources. I think we were doing the other research that researched in 30 seconds rather than 60, so it's kind of a lot of labs and all the packs are scattered all over the place, but eventually it will equalize again. So we have some really big numbers here. Now we need to do methanol, which we could do from trees if we wanted to. From synthesis gas, we could make it from methane, which is just normal gas, or from carbon dioxide. We're actually already doing these two methods to avoid wasting those resources. I'm actually wondering if maybe we should try to do this with trees and see if it's an insane number. So actually, let's back out and try it here. It's only a few machines, which is fine, and that seems like a lot of wood, but coming from trees, it's only 6.07, and we're almost doing double that with our tree setup. So we could easily do this and still have trees left over for everything else. So that seems fine. I'm not sure if we'd want to process the trees here or not. Seems like increasingly we're needing more and more wood, so we might want to. But for now, we can end it here just because we know we're going to have the wood and we'll be able to make all of the methanol there. So we're going to be making rocket fuel from trees. I'm fine with that. We're going to need the dinitrogen tetroxide gas. We're already making nitric acid, so we'll just make this. But this gas is from nitrogen dioxide gas, which might actually also come from nitric acid. So that's actually a lot of nitric acid. I don't think our factory is going to be able to make that much. And that's a lot of dioxide gas, but it will actually fit fine on one pipe here, which needs oxygen, but it comes from monoxide gas, which we should do right here. But I think we're going to need to do the matrix solver to make those numbers look right. And we can tell that the matrix solver properly solved it because it's no weird inputs or outputs. All this makes sense. So this setup is a lot of one machine into one machine. Really, the only big part of this is actually assembling the fuel. So it's going to require a small amount of water, these various catalysts, which aren't difficult to make, a lot of sodium hydroxide. We're probably going to need to upgrade our setup because we're just needing more and more and more of it. And it is going to have an output of hydrogen chloride gas. Let's come back here and separate the hydrogen out of that, link it by input. This setup is going to need some amount of chlorine. So by doing that, we save ourselves some chlorine. And we have an output, but we're going to need to make lots of ammonia gas. And we have a couple of choices here. The normal way with chemicals is to use hydrogen and nitrogen, but at these numbers, that's going to be way too much for our factory. We're essentially going to need to have a hydrogen and a nitrogen generating setup just for this because we need 6,000 ammonia gas. So I'm inclined to do a setup that is more local to this setup and does things a little differently, because we could grow blue algae, which is something we haven't done yet, to make a whole bunch of ammonia if we need to. So let's see if this would be too big. So of course, speed modules to make things smaller. It's still going to be big. And then a huge amount of this blue fiber, which comes from the blue algae. And then those blue algae come from the algae farms. So is this going to be insane? Kind of, unfortunately, because it's going to require sulfuric wastewater from our factory, and we don't actually put that on the pipe bus. We process it locally at every location. So could we put these algae farms at every single location that makes sulfuric wastewater? Yeah, probably. But we also need that for sulfur. And unfortunately, it would also require a huge amount of carbon dioxide. So like we have tree setups all over the factory, we'd have to have algae farms everywhere, and a not insignificant amount of them. So unfortunately, I think we're going to need to make the ammonia the old-fashioned way. So that's going to require a huge amount of nitrogen gas, which is going to supply some amount of oxygen to this, but it's probably going to be in excess. But we'll get what we need here. Lots of speed modules and lots of air filters. And that's probably too many air filters to have in the same spot. Like, we could put pollution consuming in here, but I'm not sure if it would actually be able to consume that much pollution per second. It might. Let's just assume that it will. And this wouldn't go through one pipe. It would have to go through essentially 6 of them. So we'd have to figure out how to make all that work. But we just want to see the numbers to see if 20 rocket silos is actually reasonable. That's actually a huge amount of red metal catalyst. But luckily they're super easy to make and only require a few ore. So that's not going to be an issue. And it's going to make a whole bunch of oxygen, which some of it we need, but the rest of it's just going to have to be put somewhere. It's probably going to be vented, to be honest. It's kind of funny to think like that, but I don't think our factory is going to be able to consume all of that, and certainly we couldn't put it on a pipe. So we're probably just going to have to vent the oxygen. Although, this setup that it's using sodium nitrate is the wrong one. Well, that means we're going to need even more ammonia. But we can. So we'll follow that down. It's going to require lots of oxygen, but we have lots of oxygen in this setup. So that makes it so there's less of it. So we still have our extra oxygen, and we're down to chlorine, hydrogen, and some of this other random stuff. But we're starting to get this cleaned up. I didn't think it would be this complicated. But here we are. Let's go with the chlorine. And we'll get some sodium hydroxide out of all of this, which will help. So we'll back out and see if we linked it correctly. Looks like no, it was linking to the sodium hydroxide, which gives us an excess of these other things. I mean, it's fine. We could do it in that way and just dump this into the factory and have this setup have its own sodium hydroxide generator. Which might not be the worst idea, considering it's only going to be 12.14 machines. So that way we wouldn't have to worry about all that sodium hydroxide. With the rest of the factory would need a huge amount of saline water though, which we would make by dumping a huge amount of salt into it. So this is why I wanted to check this ahead of time, just to make sure that nothing was too crazy. It's kind of funny that our factory can build the rockets just fine. It's the rocket fuel that's the hard part. Well, considering our factory is basically already venting chlorine and hydrogen, I kind of don't want to make extras. So let's link it to chlorine. And then if we do that, we have a slight amount of extra hydrogen. We could also link it to hydrogen. So we need a slight input of chlorine. That probably makes the most sense. And that's a lot of salt, but the factory has salt all over the place. Not to mention, it actually has saline water too. We could also make the saline water without even messing with the salt and just making it directly from regular water. It would just require a huge amount of it. I mean, we could, certainly, with ducts or just lots and lots of pipes. We could make it. But since our factory is constantly overloaded on salt, it might be nice to try to use it. Does it make sense? Well, to support 20 rocket silos, we're going to have an excess of about 2,000 oxygen gas, which that's well beyond what our factory can logistically support, so it's probably just going to be vented. And some amount of water input for however we handle the saline water, so there's multiple ways of doing it. Various catalysts, which require small amounts of materials to be delivered. It's going to require a small amount of chlorine, which the factory usually has, and of course the factory can generate chlorine on demand if required. A small amount of sodium hydroxide, which is available, and wood from trees, and lots of red metal catalysts, but they're also pretty easy to make. So that's a lot of chemicals to basically say, yes, we can do it. Because that's what I was trying to check. We're probably not going to build that setup immediately, although we're basically going to start building stuff now, because once we have this science pack research done, we can start making the satellites. So we're basically at this point now where we need to take care of all this stuff. But to check the last bit of the numbers, let's see what it takes to make a satellite. And we're still researching it, so it's going to be locked. So there we go. It's red, but that's fine. Let's link the output. It's not very many of them per second, and that's 0.05 machine, so we're fine. So then we're just looking at the rest of these numbers. It also requires its small amount of rocket fuel, which we do need to add to this total, so it's 14.08. And some of the modules might be wrong now because of that, but the numbers are essentially still linked together. That's a tiny amount of batteries, tiny amount of glass, and those rocket control units, which if we put this underneath, it will pick up those items and make them, so it's just a few more. Most of them go into the rocket, so that's no big deal. A little bit of low density structure, and these radars. This can't be a very big number. And then we would need the RTGs, which is going to require that plutonium, and a little bit of aluminum, a little bit of lead. Yeah, that's actually a reasonable amount of plutonium, 0.33. I'm curious what our fuel setup will actually consume. I know it will generate this monstrosity. It can make 6.1 plutonium a second, but I'm wondering just how much we generate for making fuel. And it's 0.02. So by comparison to the power that we need for the factory, this is actually a lot. It's about 15 times the amount we need for plutonium to run at full blast, so it's actually a lot of plutonium. And then the sodium cobaltate, which requires that cobalt oxide from batteries, and with the new updates, some of the icons have changed, either as a result of Angel Bob's or the Artisanal Reskins mod. But the cobalt oxide got a new graphic, so it's that powder instead of the little container with the powder in it. That just goes into batteries, and then the sodium carbonate we were generating with our paper setup and others, and it creates some random byproducts, which is no big deal. So everything added together, this isn't the final setup. This is just to figure out the numbers, so I don't really care that these aren't exact and clean. That's not the point of this. What we're checking to see is, are there any crazy limiting factors? And there really aren't. As far as materials, functionally, it's probably silicon nitride. We can certainly crank even more out, but that would require 2 bus slots to do. Having the one is probably fine. And these others seem reasonable, and based on how big the fuel generating setup is going to need to be to do anything more than this, I'm thinking we should stick with 20 silos for now. And it's actually going to be quite a few rocket launches. So we could take the 36.39 a second and multiply that by 60 to get how much we would get per minute, which is a little more than 2,000. So if we divide that by 1,000, we will have 2.18 rocket launches a minute. And that seems pretty reasonable. Now, certainly SpaceX is going to require a lot because I have the settings at maximum, so it requires 25 times more launches than normal. That's why, to start with, we need 175 satellites, because normally you would just need 7. But even then, we would be able to make those pretty quickly, and the playthrough's 652 hours long, so what's a few hours building rockets? So that's pretty reasonable. The main limiting factor, as many launches as we would need to do for this, is actually generating the science for the faster than light theory, and the only one that actually needs it is the one on the end, and it's going to require 2 million science, or in other words, 2,000 launches. So 2,000 launches divided by 2.18 means we would need 917 minutes, or divided by 60 gives us about 15 hours. And that seems pretty reasonable, because it's not like we're just going to not be doing anything until the end of the game when we start launching rockets. We're just going to be constantly launching them once this is built. And I think 15 hours seems pretty reasonable. It'll probably take me more than 15 hours just to make a setup big enough to do this in less than 15 hours. That's another way of looking at it. It would probably be faster just to let it launch normally. There's no replacement for stacking more productivity modules into the same machine. We should probably get all these maxed out, just for material efficiency. At some point, I'm going to need to go through the entire factory and check every single machine and every single module, make sure everything is perfect. But that's going to take a lot of work. I don't really want to do that. Not until I absolutely have to. And it is making a lot of pollution here, but these 2 farms right next door, which I specifically put here for the science bus, are doing an amazing job at keeping it from spreading too far. What's our factory's output actually at? So the output's reasonably high here. Yeah, 4.5 of it is for the accumulators to charge, but that means we're at like 3 to 4 gigawatts right now, consistently. And just these few assembling machines we've been placing are almost at a gigawatt themselves. And yeah, already, they're the most energy consuming thing in the factory. And they've barely done anything with them. While we're here, would it be too much to research the better lab? Oh no, it's actually quite easy. So this should research very quickly compared to what we're doing. That way we probably can get an extra productivity module out of all these labs. Let's see what we can do about getting the final tier of lab. So the previous tier goes into it. And surprisingly, it's not a very difficult thing to make. Just requires some random belts and inserters. How's that for everything coming full circle, where I was talking about how having the random belts and inserters in Factorio is weird, but it makes sense? Well, the last tier of lab. Random belts and inserters, instead of like these special lab parts. Although something seems very weird about that lab, considering that it's only 75 kilowatts. It makes me wonder if something weird is going on. Well, let's just make one. Well, it takes the science pack, it takes the modules, and it's an extra 0.5 faster than all the other labs that came before it. So it's clearly better, but the energy consumption is just too good. Where our first lab was 60, and then 150, 500, 2,000, and then 75. It is weird how it's called Lab 2, rather than getting its own special name. I wonder if that's a negative interaction with AI industry, which also messes with the labs. So this is technically tier 1, but a burner lab goes into that from the very early game. So I'm wondering if this was supposed to be replaced, but it got confused about which lab was which. Alright, I'm back. I looked at the mod settings for Science Cost Tweaker, and it is clear that this lab here is the final tier of lab for Science Cost Tweaker. It should take space science packs. Not sure why it's not. Must be some mod interacting with it. I tried looking at a few of them. I didn't see any issues. So my solution was to quick and dirty add the space science pack onto the end of the list here. So now it takes all of the different items, and I have noticed that the order of these is kind of weird, like gold science came later, so it should be like over here. But I don't care enough about it to try to redo the order of the science packs in the GUI. It's good enough. Space science is on the list again. But it does mean that there's no better lab, and having the 2 modules is the maximum number of modules that Science Cost Tweaker has decided upon, so I will stick with that balance. No reason to change it. Might as well just cheat if that's all I'm gonna do. So looks like a couple more labs are starting to get populated here, because we are delivering all of these better modules, which is probably producing an immense amount of pollution, but at the same time, it's being captured pretty well. And now power of the factory, 1.4 gigawatts on just these assembling machines making science. But they are saving us materials, so it's worth it. We are getting pretty close to maxing out some of these input belts, at least the ones that aren't running on coils. So at some point, if we're going to really want to max this out, we're going to have to replace all of these non-coils with coils, and then retrofit all of the setups that aren't using them to use them. And that sounds like a lot of work, so I kind of don't want to do it unless we have to. The logic on this tree setup seems a little wrong. It should be processing these trees out of saw blades. Really? Did I mess something up when I was messing around with those labs in the mod settings? Because those saw blades are gone. Well, it looks like we don't have any harmonic crystal shards, so I guess maybe it just ran through every blade we had. And the shards would go here, and we are out because, oh yeah, we've been kind of clogged on this crystal dust for a while now because of the inserter settings being wrong on this setup, which is kind of an issue. Let's see here. Let's create, I don't know exactly how many of these we'd want, but let's do a whole bunch of them. That'll push them all to the back, but once we've got this emptied out, we can kind of push them back in. Because now this is all getting emptied out, because we have way too many of all these crystals. And I don't know how fast the belts should be, but let's just make them purple so this gets emptied as quickly as possible. Actually, one thing we can do with all this crystal slurry, it would be incredibly annoying, but we could ship it all the way down here, and if we put it in the network, it would be turned into mineral sludge, which would then get crystallized. And that apparently needs to be something we need to do here. So let us push a pipe down, and we're just going to do a whole bunch of drones. But we're going to want some logic there. So these normally run to fill this up as high as it'll get. If it needs more help, those ones will run. But we need to empty it if it gets too full. So we'll say if slurry is more than 40,000, it can run, and it absolutely is now. And let's see what this is set at. 10,000, that's a good number. Okay. And then we need to warp down here and basically put everything into this tank because it is hooked up to the logic up there. So it'll be a request depot for the slurry, and I don't know, 10 drones is probably not going to be enough for this. We put a pump in, some pipes, and there they go. Oh hey, the research is almost done. Fantastic. That means we can pick some other researches. Okay, we're back here now. And we have finally emptied all of that extra uranium we had. So let's put that back in there. Now we don't need any of that. And it's waiting for the level to get below 23,000, which it's pretty close to now. But once that level goes down, it will start running both. So I guess we'll just check Circuit HUD here and wait until we see uranium running, and then we'll know. So we've got space science ready. But of course, there's lots of other stuff that will just be useful for our journey there. And this stuff is usually ordered in cheapest to most expensive. Not always, but it's ordered by science pack, so the gold science starts here. So usually the cheap ones are in the beginning. So if you're not sure what you want to do, a lot of times just starting at the beginning here can help. I don't even know. There's so much good stuff. Well, making the artillery better would help. Its range is not that much more, at least the automatic range, but it's some. And sure, better steam engines, better boilers, better electric boiler, better fluid burning boiler, better electric furnaces. Sure, all that stuff will be useful eventually. Okay, we got some more drones, so let's put another 10 in there. That ought to help. Looks like we're finally getting there, that we've unclogged this much. And of course, we have so much. We have like almost several 100,000 of it just sitting around, so it needs to clear through here and then clear through there so this can start running. So the trees are gonna have to wait a little while. I'm kind of worried because we generate trees very quickly, so it doesn't take very long before we have 32,000 trees in here waiting to be processed. But this is definitely more setup than we can produce, so we will eventually get through those trees with time. And there we go. The first pack of drones made it. Filling this up, which means the second pack of drones, all the way down here, should have left, and they did. They are right there. Could probably put even more of them in there, but I'm not sure exactly how fast we're going to need to consume all this, but I don't know, maybe we should just put like 40 drones in there, just to make sure we get this cleared out in a reasonable amount of time, because there is a lot of slurry stuck. Looks like it's just clearing this out enough where it can start running again, but the one we want to run is this one, which makes sense why it's the one that's stuck, because it has lower priority. So we're just going to have to wait it out. But let's come down here and put another final 10 drones, and it looks like we're basically maxing it out with 30, but now with 40 we know for sure. There is enough drones in here to make use of all of that, and those are just robot crashes. Because they are moving a lot of concrete right now. Man, that research is going so quick. Was not expecting that. Well, I guess our upgrades to all the science really helped. Look at that. It's just zooming. Well, let's throw some more stuff on here then. How about some vehicle solar panels? Sure, we don't really need them, but that's just one more thing off the list. And having the better plasma turrets would be nice. They certainly do a great deal of work defending the factory, so having the best one would be nice. And we're actually using all of our logistics robots for once, so we are building more. Interestingly, the accumulators are below 15%, but all of these are running. And that's actually bad, but it looks like accumulator charge is increasing here, so that happens because our power demands are so high now. In fact, it's 6 gigawatts right now. That the accumulators kind of dipped down lower than 15 before the plutonium had a chance to heat up the reactors. And now that they're heating up, it's starting to charge the accumulator again, but it means we're getting close to the maximum power output of our plutonium reactors here, which means we might need even more power than this, which we could do thorium. We've got the curium on hand. We just need to do the research and the processing to get to that point. Yeah, when you look at our power output here, it's about 2 gigawatts for just the labs and 1 gigawatt for the assembling machines making the science packs. So 3 gigawatts for just the end point of science, not to mention everything else in the factory. So the plutonium reactor's turned off now, and we're only at about 22%, so they barely got it charged. Luckily there's a tail to it, which helps keep the batteries from just immediately discharging, but well, it's getting to that point now. And actually we can look at the 10-minute plot here to see what the duty cycle is of the reactors. So you can see how it immediately fires up, but then the last few reactors take a little while, but then it's at full power here. And then this is the tail where everything cools down, and then it kind of waits a little bit. So we're probably at about 2/3 power right now. 2/3 power output for the plutonium reactors. So we're actually using quite a bit of it now. And there we go. Now this is cleared out a little better. It's going to take a while for all of that junk to be processed, but alright, so we have seedling nests in here. Can you not process them? Oh, I see, because of water. So to get rid of that, we're just going to need a clarifier in here. And it's going to need to be a lot faster than that. Now it's picking up compost and soil, which does have uses elsewhere. Oh, cool. Made a request of our insulating boards, which there it is, which means we can see our new setup actually work. And it seems a little slow, but that's because it's working at 30 per second, not 60. So it's not going to fully populate that belt. Let's warp over there. It's kind of so weird to be looking at something on map view and just be like, no, I want to go there, and just warp there. So we can take a direct look at it. Looks like it could potentially help to have a little bit more wood, but it's basically going at the maximum speed of these inserters anyway. And right here, at our uranium setup, you can see that the centrifuges at the very back are actually running now, which means that we are starting to consume uranium, that these units in the back are firing up, and eventually their resources will get up here. Oh, hey, look at that. So we did get a piece of uranium, and robots are being assigned to pick stuff up. Of course, it will only work if the reactor that they so happen to pick to put it in has enough uranium for all 4 reactors, but it'll balance out in the end. Well, one other thing we can do to easily improve our material efficiency is research all of these tier 2 of coils, because we built the setups to easily be converted to run on coolant. So all we need is the research to be done, and then we can set all these to coolant. We do get some extra recipes with titanium by mixing in aluminum and tin and chrome and cobalt, but everything's kind of built now, and as long as it works, I don't feel the need to do anything differently. And since we're doing a lot of research, we might as well increase the speed of the lab. And mining productivity will certainly help too. That's a big research though. So I almost want to do some of the easier stuff. So we can finally get access to robot logistics for the rest of the warehouse types. So we'll go through those. How are those crystals going? Well, good news. We've cleared out enough of it that we're finally making those harmonic crystals again. And they're being produced, and hopefully they'll make their way down to wood soon. Oh, they're already here. Great. And we just need to build up our supply of saw blades again. Well, now that this thing is mostly empty, we could probably stop aggressively removing items out of it here. And they are continuing to run to get rid of all of that. But it should balance itself out now. And it looks like we have even more orbs to collect. Pollution may be a lot lower than it used to be, but it's still enough to make the biters angry. And that's fine, because we need these orbs for spaceship parts. So we are slowly building up more uranium. You see, it's definitely being produced. It's just we need to get enough of it into the reactors to actually start running, because it's definitely starting to cycle on here. Oh, hey, there we go. One of the uranium reactors finally got enough fuel to start running. And there it is. It's going to keep running until it's worked down through all of its fuel. And I guess it makes sense that's the one that's running because it's probably one of the closest. And that's the end of this episode. On the next one, we're going to have a talk about thorium power and continue to upgrade the factory and get ready for rockets. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.